And welcome back. Well, it's the fiscal cliffhanger, and some Republican lawmakers are fired up, saying the president is a big part of the problem.
It's a shame that in this nation, where every developed country in the world knows that our greatest threat is our fiscal solvency, that you have to have these leverage points. You would think that people would just sit down, solve the problem, because we know it is our greatest threat, but that's not the case here. We have a president who has not laid out a plan. He's obviously a spendaholic.
So our next guest says Washington needs to stop spending, or spending hikes will stop Washington. Joining us now is Fox News contributor and nationally syndicated columnist Deroy Murdock. Nice to see you this morning, Deroy.
Clayton, good to see you.
Let's be honest, both parties don't like cutting. The size of government hasn't been shrunk since the 1950s. Neither party has done this. Will Washington ever stop spending?
Clayton, my fear is that they never will stop spending, and this will go on and on and on, and this country will face an ever more potentially devastating fiscal situation. And even the cuts they're talking about now are essentially decreases in the rate of increase. So instead of going up like this, maybe the spending will go up like that.
And then they say, hey, we've got savings because we simply cut the rate of increase, but we didn't actually cut things.
What we need to do is talk about actual reductions. And for example, there's a great idea called the Mack Penny Plan. Congressman Connie Mack, who's leaving Congress, unfortunately, has a very simple idea, which is this year we're going to spend 100 cents on the dollar. Next year we'll spend 99 cents on the dollar. The year after that, 98 cents on the dollar. And each year you decrease spending by 1 penny per dollar. And people who are running government agencies, cabinet officials ought to be able to figure out, okay, we can save something here, reduce that, get out of this line of business, and slowly but surely you bring the government level of spending from 24% of GDP, where it is now, down to 18%.
You even cite Raul Castro in your column about this, because you said you disagree with him almost entirely, but you do agree with him on one point, which is what?
He had a great quote, which was, no country has the luxury of spending more than it has. And even the dictator of Cuba understands this, and a lot of people in Washington want to spend more money than we have. They're going to continue to do this if they don't actually reduce spending.
We heard the first plan, the Mack Penny Plan, which sounds sensible. Of course, Congress probably won't do it if it's sensible.
That's
Number two on the list, though, Washington should terminate antiquated and extraneous programs.
Sure. I think what we need to do is take government agencies that have been involved in things that might have made sense in the past and just say, look, the government's not going to do this anymore. For example, in 1935, Franklin Roosevelt started something called the Rural Electrification Administration to get power into Appalachia. Well, they did that. Now guess what they're doing? They're still there, and now they're putting in internet broadband. So this is something that Time Warner and other companies ought to be able to do. Private companies should be able to do this. And the people who work in those companies should be, or work for that agency should be given severance pay, thanked for their hard service, shut down that agency, and move on.
Do you have to create, though, another level of bureaucracy to start auditing these types of departments to find out that the Rural Electrification Act is still implemented and that people are still getting away with arguing that they can put up power poles up in rural Montana?
No, you don't need an agency to do that. The Cato Institute, Citizens Against Government Waste, National Taxpayers Union, all these organizations have lists of agencies, programs that ought to be terminated. For example, I think the entire Department of Housing and Urban Development, I mean, the Washington, D.C. really did a great job of almost wrecking the housing sector in 2008. They spend money trying to bring prices of homes down to keep them affordable and yet keep home prices up so people have valuable nest eggs. Which is it? So why don't we take the Department of HUD, thank everyone there, and send them home?
So that's just one example. By shrinking the size of the federal government and decreasing some of these departments, what other departments would be on your chopping block? I mean, we saw the post office dealing with some major budget problems this year.
$16 billion. That ought to be privatized. Why not just give it to the workers of the post office and let them own it, let them run it, let them try to run it at a profit? That's an example. The Department of Agriculture. Look, I'm all for food safety. There's probably a federal role there to make sure that the food we eat doesn't poison us. But why do we have people sitting in offices in Washington determining what the price of sugar ought to be, paying $1.8 billion a year to pay farmers not to farm? This makes no sense, particularly when we're $16.4 trillion in the hole.
Special interests come to mind with all of this, right? Because I think most of the reasons why Washington doesn't cut spending is because they're accountable for some of this. Someone has paid for their campaign.
Sure.
Money's been pouring into these campaigns, so they're accountable back home to these organizations that come into their offices. So do any of these three plans you mentioned get away with special interests? Are special interests off to the side? Because that's where I think we could actually see some real change if special interests aren't involved.
Well, the special interests always will be there. What's necessary is leadership to stand up and say, look, Mr. Lobbyist or Ms. Consultant, it'd be great to continue with this, but we're $16.4 trillion in the red. This is just getting worse and worse. We're going to hit the debt limit very soon. And at some point, we've got to say enough is enough. For example, private sector workers make $64,000 on average in this country. federal workers making $128,000, exactly double. It ought to be able to take not too much leadership to say, look, let's bring federal worker pay down closer to where the level is of the average taxpayer. It takes some courage, it takes some leadership, but those are exactly the kind of things we need to keep this country from going totally broke.
Interesting discussion. Let's see if Congress is paying attention, but they're probably still half home for the holidays. Deroy Murdock, great to see you.
Good to see you.
Have a great New Year.
Happy New Year.
Coming up on the show.